we left off, okay, we were talking about the functional areas of the cerebrum, but some things that you might want to kind of keep in mind from the previous lecture class. I want you to keep the concept in your heads that certain regions of the brains have certain functions. So we refer to them as functional areas. So like for your frontal lobe, all right, for the cerebrum there, all right, the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, okay, that lobe has conscious thought, okay, judgment, personality, critical thinking. I mean, the list goes on and on, all right, reasoning, okay. The occipital lobe has your visual cortex, so sight and visual memories. The temporal lobe has hearing and smell, okay? So just kind of keep in mind, because we're going to revisit this in a little bit, certain regions of the cerebrum will have certain functions assigned to them. It's pretty much the same for everybody. Now, it won't be the exact same area down to the millimeter, all right, for everybody. You know, my motor speech center could be a couple millimeters superior in my frontal lobe than maybe Stacy's is, okay? So, but it's still going to be in that general area. There's always exceptions to the rule, okay? So keep that in mind. We're going to hit a concept here in a little bit called cerebral lateralization, and we'll kind of revisit some of these concepts here. So quickly, just talking about autism here, I'm sure many of you folks are familiar with it. Either you know somebody, you've read about it, all right? But autism is something that we've really kind of put a lot of emphasis in learning about in, when I say recent years, in the past 10 to 20 years. All right, but you know, folks that do have autism, especially in the children, you will notice certain peculiarities, you know, a little bit, some social awkwardness or some inability to communicate effectively, or I'm not going to say normally, all right, because sometimes I don't think I communicate normally, all right, but they'll have some difficulty with their ability to communicate. And so when we're talking about the autism order, we've created what we call the autism spectrum, meaning it ranges from mild autism to severe autism, all right? And so obviously folks that have a more mild autism, all right, are going to be, when they become an adults, will be more likely to be independent, all right? They'll be higher functioning, their levels of intelligence and communication will be a little bit higher than those folks that with severe autism, that they might not even be able to communicate at all. Okay, so we kind of threw together the spectrum there to kind of provide a range of how severe or how mild, all right, this condition is. Autism is still relatively unknown at this point. When I say unknown, the causes, the etiology, all right. There's several hypotheses. Obviously, genes, genetics ranges highly up there. There can be environmental conditions. I'm sure many of you folks have heard about the vaccination cause, and the whole vaccination thing. I've done some research into that, and you know, I know on the slide there it says vaccines found not to be a factor. And the whole reason why vaccines got started in this discussion in the first place is because I cannot remember the one doctor's name, but they were looking over several different research studies, and basically they had accumulated all this data, and from that data that they accumulated, they made an inference. So they made this hypothesis that autism was possibly caused by vaccines, and then that caught on and became pretty popular in some mainstream circles there. So there's a lot of back and forth on that. So I tell folks all the time, I said, you know, there's no studies that claim that vaccines do cause autism, okay? But there aren't any studies that say that it doesn't cause autism, because to be honest with you, there's no way that anybody's going to fund a study in which you have to try to cause autism in somebody by injecting them with vaccines. No one's going to sign their kid up for that. So it's virtually impossible to get that underway. All right, enough about autism. Let's jump into white matter. Okay, now remember, in lab class earlier this week, we discussed that white matter is going to be myelinated axon. End of story, that is it. Okay? So the white matter in the brain, all right, in the cerebrum, is going to be deep to the superficial gray matter, and we call that superficial gray matter like that the eggshell or the chocolate eggshell that you find on the outside of a Cadbury egg. That's called the cerebral cortex. Okay, so the white matter will be deep to that, and in the central nervous system, we call myelinated axons that are bundled together or parallel to one another. We call those tracts. 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 Okay. So there's a couple different types of tracts that I want you to be familiar with. And the first one are the association tracts. Okay. So they're going to connect specific areas in the cerebral cortex within the same hemisphere. Okay. So I'm going to show you, remember, same hemisphere. So quick picture here for the association tracts, right? You can see the association tracts. These are going to be these purple ones here. So this hemisphere is going to be the right hemisphere. So these association tracts will connect different parts on the same side of the cerebrum. And we refer to those as association tracts. And there's two types. Okay? You've got the short ones, which are called arcuate. They're going to connect the neighboring or adjacent gyri to one another. And then the longitudinal, always remember long, all right? These are longer tracts. And so they're going to connect gyri in different lobes of the brain, okay? Or, excuse me, of the cerebrum, okay? So back to that picture here, you can see here are these little short swoopy arcuate fibers here that are connecting neighboring gyri to one another. Then you got your longitudinal tracts, and they go quite a distance here. Okay, so keep that in mind. Long, longitudinal. Okay. All right. The next type of tracts are called commissural tracts. All right. These guys will connect the different hemispheres of the cerebrum, left and right, right and left. All right. So we saw when we were labeling the brain, the largest one, which is the corpus callosum. And then you have two smaller ones, all right, that are close to the corpus callosum. You've got the anterior commissure and the posterior commissure. Okay, those little guys, I mean, they're not nearly as big, all right, as the corpus callosum. Okay, so here is our corpus callosum. That's a big commissural tract there. Then you can see just in front of it is the anterior commissure. The posterior commissure is back in this region here. Okay, so remember, the commissural fibers are going to connect the different hemispheres, okay, the different sides of your cerebrum, okay? All right, so we've got tracts that go, all right, throughout the cerebrum, but now there's another type of tract that we haven't talked about, and these are called projection tracts. And these tracts are going to go up and down. So if you kind of think the other tracts, the association, the commissural tracts, are going to be front and back, side to side. Right, the projection tracts are going to be up and down. So they're going to link, all right, the cerebral cortex, that gray matter there, that shell, all right, to either the lower areas of the inferior brain regions, or they might even go all the way down to the spinal cord. Okay, so we give them specific names for where they go. For example, the cortical spinal tracts, right, refers to the cortex, the cortical region, and all the way down to the spinal cord. So these tracts will go from the cerebral cortex down to the spine. Okay, so this is important to understand, all right, these three different types of tracts, all right, when you're learning, because we're going to start, not in this chapter, but we'll talk about a couple different pathways, all right, that we're going to find in the central nervous system, and I want you to be able to be familiar when I use certain terms that you're like, oh, okay, this is a projection tract, this is going, it runs superior and inferior, all right, this is a commissural tract, all right, this is going to cross from one side of the brain to the other. And then the association tracts are just going to, move to, will be on the same side of the brain, but they could be either a long distance or a short distance. Right? So keep that in mind. Right? All right. Let's jump into our picture here of our projection tracts. So here you can see, all right, our commissural tracts. This is the corpus callosum going from right to left and left to right, connecting the different hemispheres of the brain. And then we have our projection tracts, which are going superior to inferior or inferior to superior. They go up and down. Okay, so it can connect different parts of the cerebral cortex to the brainstem, all right, or it can go all the way down here into the spinal cord. Okay, that's it for the tracts. Any questions about tracts? This, that, and the other? Okay. I threw this in here because Petalias, there's nothing really crazy about Petalias, but I just think it's a cool word to say. But also, I like to point out oddities about certain anatomical structures, and Petalias are basically asymmetries that we find, right, in the brain here. All right, perfect example is, right, the frontal one of the frontal lobes might protrude a little bit more anterior than the other frontal lobe. So in this example here, what we're showing you is a right-handed individual, right? Their pedilia, their protrusion of that frontal lobe, or that one specific lobe there, okay, is going to protrude on the right side more anterior compared to the left. But in contrast to that, on the posterior area, back here in the occipital region, all right, the left occipital lobe will protrude more posteriorly, all right, than the right occipital lobe. Okay, and then that whole pattern, it gets flip-flopped when we're dealing with left-handed people. So if we're dealing with a left-handed person, their right frontal lobe will protrude more anterior, and their let's say left-handed person, their left frontal lobe will protrude more anterior than the right frontal lobe, and then their right occipital lobe will protrude more than the left occipital lobe. Okay. All right. I really want to get into cerebral lateralization. Okay. This is pretty much where a lot of folks have heard terms like, hey, I'm a left-sided brain person, or I'm a right-sided brain person. And so this goes back to that concept where I was telling you about how specific regions of your brain, right, have certain functional specializations, right? So this hemisphere specialization, we call that cerebral lateralization, okay? Meaning, right, certain hemispheres are going to have certain specific higher order functions. For example, right, the left side of your cerebrum, right, that's where you're going to find your speech centers, both motor and your sensory speech comprehension. Okay, so when we talk about cerebral lateralization, we break it down into a categorical hemisphere and what we call a representational hemisphere. Now, I think of the categorical hemisphere as kind of like that mathy kind of smarty pants person. Okay, these people, all right, are going to be, I don't want to say book smart, right, but they are exceptional. I shouldn't say exceptional. Their ability, all right, the categorical hemisphere is where you're going to have your language abilities, and that's why we see our speech centers on that left side there. But not only that, all right, when we're doing categorization and analysis, that's going to be functions like math issues or computations, or just a lot of what you're doing in this class, all right, especially for the physiology, you're going to be utilizing, all right, the categorical hemisphere. And in most people, it's going to be the left hemisphere. Right? Not everybody, but in most people. Okay, we're going to talk about the difference here in a moment. That means that the left hemisphere is the categorical hemisphere. Right? The representational hemisphere is going to be the right hemisphere. Now, these folks are more of the artistic musical types. All right, this is where you're going to see your visual spatial relationships, imagination, real creative, your creativity is going to normally be found in, right, the right hemisphere here. Okay, so but not to worry, all right, these two hemispheres are not going to be separate from each other, because don't forget, you have your commissural fibers, you have the corpus callosum and the anterior and posterior commissural tracts that are able to communicate, right, to both sides, because, all right, we have found that there are some folks that are musically inclined, right, so they're going to be using the representational hemisphere, right, but they have certain relationships with math, okay, that we found, and again, not with everybody, but folks that have a keen musical talent will also be pretty good in some of the math and sciences, right? So, and it's because they're able to communicate between both hemispheres through those commissural fibers there, right? So this lateralization, all right, where one side of the brain is going to develop into, all right, the categorical side, and the other one's going to develop into the representational side. This starts to happen early on. Okay, so we're looking at 5 and 6, and that's why it's very important, you know, that we start kids young and exposing them to lots of different things. And I'm not just saying to schoolwork and whatnot, but to instruments, different art and creativity. If they take to it, they take to it, which is great. This helps to foster that. Okay. Now we have seen in studies that this lateralization, right, is different between men and women, and this is one of the reasons why I'm troubled by women, because their posterior portion of their corpus callosum is bigger than us men. Right, more connections, and so it's believed that women are able to integrate the cohesiveness or the communication between the two hemispheres much more efficiently than men. So you got us beat on that one, ladies. So, and you live longer. So, but anyways, that is why if men are suffer from some sort of brain issue, you know, brain damage from a collision or damage to the skull to one side, they can suffer much more from disabilities, functional loss, if one side of the brain is damaged compared to the other, because we don't have that communication ability like women do. So you heard me say that normally when we're talking about the cerebral lateralization, that a right-handed individual, all right, the left side or left hemisphere is going to be the categorical hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is going to be the representational one. And so that's usually the case. But an interesting fact is, if you are a left-handed individual, then either hemisphere can be categorical. So I always find it's a 50-50 toss-up for left-handed folks. So a left-handed person might be the same as a right-handed person, or their categorical hemisphere could be their right hemisphere, right? So I thought that was kind of an interesting fact there. All right, so this picture here is showing us, okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. All right, one, the right and left-handedness of the individual, but you can see here when we're talking about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, normally the left is categorical. You can see here is going to be our Broca's area, our motor speech area, okay, which is what I'm using right now. All right, that's the motor component of speech. I always remember the Broca's area is in the front of the brain, in the frontal lobe. Right, B is before W in the alphabet, because the sensory portion or the language comprehension part of our speech is back here in Wernicke's area. Right, that is the parietal lobe. So B is in the front, B is in the front of the alphabet, W is in the back, W is in the back of the alphabet. Okay, so motor speech, what I'm using right now is I'm talking to you, as you're listening to me and hopefully understanding what I'm saying, you're utilizing your Wernicke's area. Okay. All right. So you can just see a couple different areas here, some mapping back here. We see our visual regions here, and then we have, again, some of our sensory area here, right? I mean, different areas. My point from this slide is for you folks to really get an understanding that certain areas of the brain are going to have certain functional capabilities, which leads me into epilepsy. Okay. Epilepsy is a neurological disorder, and it's one in which, again, it can vary in the severity of it. Okay. And basically, it is when you have electrical signals, your nerve signals, your action potentials, all right, that are just firing off, all right, rapidly, all right, frequently, but there's no rhyme or reason in certain situations. Now, there is for some, you may have suffered a head injury. As a result of that, you may be afflicted with epilepsy because of the damage that occurred from that. Some folks just have a neurological condition for epilepsy. But the fact of the matter is that the neurons are just rapidly firing and discharging action potentials. Okay? Now, it can, depending on how bad the epilepsy is, will determine the treatment. Okay? If it can be managed with medications, great. My father-in-law has epilepsy, and he uses medications and has managed it quite well. In some situations, medications aren't enough, so it might require surgery. Okay, and in really bad cases, you actually have to remove, all right, certain portions of the brain, as long as it's safe to do so, all right, that are responsible, right, or that are causing the epileptic disorder. Okay, so we call that a hemispherectomy, right? But here's the thing: even though that you've removed, right, part of that brain and some of the functional activities that are associated with that brain removal tissue, or that removed brain tissue, excuse me, right? Your brain is a miraculous thing, and depending on severity of your condition and how much, and depending on what a region was removed, right, other areas of the brain that are kind of left behind can actually take over some of that function that was lost, and they'll make up for it. Okay, it's a really cool thing. We see it, think of it like with strokes. Sometimes actually, hold that thought. Our next slide is a stroke, okay, which is known as a cerebral vascular accident, a CVA. And let me just define stroke for you, and then I'll get back to my point, right? So in many cases, a stroke can be caused by either obstructed blood vessel that supplies blood to the brain, or when you have an aneurysm in which blood vessel tears or bursts, and it starts to hemorrhage into the area. Either way, you will have damaged tissue because the blood supply of that tissue has been compromised. And nervous tissue is very, very sensitive and demanding tissue that within minutes that tissue can start to die. Okay? So it really depends on how long that tissue has been deprived of the blood and the nutrients in the blood will determine how severe the damage is. Some of the symptoms that you'll see, depending on the severity and also where, all right, the black blood vessel was supplying, or where the bleed is occurring, all right. But some of those symptoms can include vision symptoms, blurry vision, all right. They can start to get tunnel vision, start to lose vision, muscular weakness, right, especially if you're affecting the motor cortex there. Okay, you can start to get paralysis in certain issues, right? Folks will complain of a real bad headache at times. Balance will be off, dizziness, all right? They'll have issues moving their skeletal muscles, all right, and doing certain activities like walking, picking something up. They might not even be able to move some of their limbs, all right? Their face will start to, either their mouth will start to droop down, okay? In this situation, here comes that concept that we learned last class, right? That I don't think it was this section. I think it was the other section. Usually, if you get a stroke or a cerebral vascular accident on the right side of your body, on the right side of your brain, then the left side of your body gets affected. So it's going to affect the opposite side of the body. Okay, and so usually in these cases, obviously, hopefully the damaged blood vessel can be repaired, and hopefully it won't be permanent. But there could still be some damage. So usually rehab has to occur. All right, so some sort of occupational physical therapy, and if some of that tissue is damaged permanently, right? Going back to what I was saying earlier. Doing that physical therapy, you start to stimulate other areas of the brain, and they can pick up some of that functionality that was lost during that stroke. In some cases, we have what people call mini strokes or TIAs, and that is a much more minor or mild, but it's a brief episode. So it could be a perfect example, a vasospasm. So say one of your cerebral blood vessels starts to go into vasospasm, and for a period of time, not too long, and it deprives. Is a TIA the same as syncope? No. TIA is a condition. Syncope is a symptom. Yeah, syncope is that lightheadedness. It can lead to passing out. But yeah, syncope. Yeah, TIA is an actual condition. So with the TIA, all right, that vasospasm deprives blood to that specific area of the brain, and so people will complain of mild stroke-like symptoms. And in some cases, it can be signs and symptoms of a potential stroke that can occur. So if that person does not seek, isn't there two different strokes that affect the warning? Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, that's a great question. Hold on, Casey, that's a great question. Yes, because both of those areas have different blood supply. So again, it depends which artery or blood vessel, and it can be a vein that may have ruptured, or a dural venous sinus that may have ruptured and is bleeding into that area there that can kill some of that tissue. So yeah, two different strokes that can affect the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area. Yes, that is true. All right, let's move on to the second region of our brain, the diencephalon. All right, so it's really important for you folks to know, okay, the three structures that make up the diencephalon. Okay, we're going to talk about all of them: the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. Now we'll talk about the hypothalamus here for a bit, but you're going to get into a little bit more detail in chapter 17, okay, and 211. So we'll talk about some of the non-endocrine functions of the hypothalamus there. All right, so this blue area here, I don't know if you can see it. All right, this blue, purple, whatever color that is outlining the diencephalon. So everything within this, and the diencephalon is pretty much in the center here of the cerebrum. Okay. So the three structures for the diencephalon are going to be the thalamus right here. All right. Then you got the hypothalamus down here. Okay. And then you've got the epithalamus, which is made up of two structures, right? The habenular nucleus, and then we saw this guy before in lab, the pineal gland. All right. So we're going to go through all that. So just to kind of get a little bit of a picture, you can see here's the brainstem down here. This is the midbrain. This is the pons down here. So the thalamus kind of sits on top of the brainstem. Okay. And actually, you can see also this region here is the third ventricle. Okay, so this that I'm showing you is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So the thalamus makes up the lateral walls of the third ventricle, whereas the hypothalamus is kind of like the bottom portion of the third ventricle. And then you got back here in the epithalamus that makes up what we call the roof of the diencephalon, or the third ventricle back here. All right. Okay. Let's talk about the first part, the epithalamus. Okay, so the epithalamus has the two structures, the pineal gland and habenular nuclei. Okay, the pineal gland, this is the one I think I was telling you about, that movie from Beyond where the guy's pineal gland popped out of his head. But what you should know is the pineal gland produces, right, melatonin. Right? It is an endocrine gland. Endocrine is a gland that does not have ducts. That means it has to secrete its secretion into a nearby blood vessel or into the interstitial fluid or tissue around the actual gland itself. Okay? So melatonin helps to regulate your circadian rhythms, which is your sleep-wake cycle. We talked about that briefly with melatonin. People will sometimes give that or take that. Excuse me. No, I've not taken any melatonin. But the melatonin will make you drowsy and help you to fall asleep. Okay. So the other structure is the habenular nuclei. And this structure is part of the limbic system. But what I really enjoy about it, all right, it's going to the limbic system, all right, is going to be our emotional system. You know, it's affiliated with our emotions. And so the habenular nuclei, right, is going to relay signals from our emotion centers, the limbic system, to the midbrain. Okay, and this is very, very helpful, all right, especially during olfaction or smell, right? So basically what it does is when you smell something that's pleasant, okay, and if you've ever been, this happens to me quite frequently, especially if I smell barbecue. Right, if I'm driving down the road and I'm smelling some good barbecue, one, my mouth will start to water. All right, starts to salivate. That's the beginning of digestion, by the way. Right, but in most cases, it makes me nostalgic. All right, and it brings me back to family barbecues and family reunions in which we were cooking barbecue. Right, and I get an emotional response from that. Usually, it's not disgust. All right, it's actually joy because we always had a good time at our family barbecues and family reunions. So this habenular nuclei is a relay center between the limbic system and the midbrain. It helps, right, when you smell something, it helps to evoke emotional responses, that feeling of happiness or joy, or maybe sadness, depression, fear, who knows. And also you get a visceral response in which you start to salivate. All right. The second part of the diencephalon is the thalamus. Okay. Now the thalamus is an oval-like structure. Usually I say a football, but it looks more like a loaf of bread to me. Okay. It's an oval structure made of gray matter. Okay. So if it's gray matter, it's going to have cell bodies in there, right, and dendrites and whatnot, and some unmyelinated axons. Right. This it makes up the lateral walls of the third ventricle there. And there's two of them. You have one in the right cerebrum and one in the left. And it has a little like bridge in between the two thalami, I guess you'd call it. Okay, we call that the interthalamic adhesion, and that connects both your left and your right thalamus to one another. And each thalamus, all right, has about a dozen or 12 nuclei. Now, just to remind you, a nuclei, all right, is made up of cell bodies. Okay, it's a cluster of cell bodies. And usually when we're discussing a cluster of cell bodies, you should start to think of synapses. Okay, usually when we're dealing with cell bodies, especially when we're talking about the central nervous system, right, start to think of synapses. So what will happen is, all right, these axons, right, are going to project into the thalamus from different regions of the spinal cord. Some will come from the cerebellum. They'll project into the thalamus, and then from the thalamus, it'll go out into particular areas of the cerebral cortex there. Okay. So keep in mind, you'll have, all right, these cell bodies that are found here in the thalamus, and they'll project their axon maybe to the occipital lobe. or to the parietal lobe, or maybe to the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so this fact here is a wonderful fact. I've not seen a test question on it, but doesn't mean there isn't one. But the thalamus, all right. If I didn't say this, I don't think I did say it today. Think of the thalamus as a relay center. Okay, it's the relay center, right? Because the thalamus will relay information to all the different parts of the cerebral cortex. Okay, but this other fact here is that it receives signals from all conscious senses except for smell. Right? Sight goes there, taste goes there, touch goes there, pain, all that. But smell does not. Okay, so because the thalamus is a relay center, all right, it will also act as a filter. Lots of information projects into the thalamus, okay? Like I said, some of that information, all right, will get projected into the cerebral cortex, and then it comes to consciousness, right? But if it doesn't make it to the thalamus, all right, and it doesn't get projected out of the thalamus into another area of the cerebral cortex, then you don't have conscious awareness of it. Perfect example is the background noise in a crowded room. Right? If you've ever sat in a cafeteria, all right, trying to read a book in a relatively loud area there, okay, some people could do it. I had an uncle, not an uncle, excuse me, I had a cousin who could sit in a room full of people, and I'm talking about 20, 30 people, and he used to do this. He could sit there reading a medical textbook, not interact with a darn person. He could sit there and he could block out everybody and read that medical textbook and actually understand what he read, okay? So the thalamus helps to kind of block out those distracting sounds or stimuli, all right? So you can focus, right, on other stimuli or other functions, okay? So think of it as a relay center, okay? For some signals, not all. All right, so here's a picture of the thalamus. It looks like two big bread loaves sitting next to each other. Okay, you got one on the right, one on the left. Right, and then it's broken down into all these different nuclei. Okay, and then from these nuclei, it will project a neuron into different areas of the cerebral cortex. All right, here comes the last one, the hypothalamus. Now, just a little bit of a helpful hint when you're taking your test, okay? And you come across a question, and you have no earthly idea what the answer is. If one of your answer choices is hypothalamus, mark that. Okay? Because after we go through the hypothalamus, you're going to see everything that's responsible for. So there's a good chance that hypothalamus is the correct answer. Right? That's if you have absolutely no idea. Okay? If you're kind of caught between a couple different answer choices, well, then that's a little bit tougher. Right? But that's usually some of the advice I give to people is to answer hypothalamus. Okay? All right. So the last part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. Okay? This is found on the lower portion and the anterior inferior portion of the diencephalon. Okay? And it is connected to the pituitary gland by the infundibulum. And that's actually how the hypothalamus, right, is able to communicate with the pituitary gland. So some of the things that the hypothalamus is involved in, right? And one of my favorite functions is listed here first. It controls your autonomic nervous system. Now there's two parts to your nervous system functionally. You've got your somatic nervous system, okay? That is all the stuff that you are consciously aware of and that you can voluntarily control, okay? And then you've got the autonomic nervous system, okay? That nervous system controls, I don't want to say this. The autonomic nervous system is like the autopilot, okay? It operates below your conscious level, okay? So as you can see here, the autonomic nervous system, and this is just a few things that the autonomic nervous system, all right, is involved with. But it's going to control your heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, and those are numerous activities. All right, respiration, your urinary system, okay, parts of the reproductive system, right? So the autonomic nervous system is involved in many, many functions of the body. And the hypothalamus controls that. So that's just that one function is a pretty hefty function. But just you wait, because we got more. The next one is the endocrine system. Now, if you remember back in chapter 1, we talked about, all right, homeostasis and how you have a receptor, a control center, and an effector. When we were talking about the control center, there's two systems that fall under the control center: the nervous system and the endocrine system. So now you have the hypothalamus, right? This little area of neural tissue that controls the control center for both, or part of the control center for the nervous system, but also the endocrine system, right? That's huge. That's huge. Okay. So basically what the hypothalamus does is it's going to influence the anterior pituitary. The pituitary has an anterior portion and a posterior portion. Right? That's the pituitary. Right? The front part is the anterior, right? Also known as the adenohypophysis. And then the back part is called the posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis. Okay. Anyways, okay, the endocrine system, the hypothalamus will stimulate and secrete hormones from itself that will influence the anterior pituitary to either secrete a hormone or not to secrete hormones. So it's going to influence what the anterior pituitary does. Not only that, hypothalamus makes antidiuretic hormone. That's the hormone that keeps you from being dehydrated, and oxytocin. Okay, so it makes both of those hormones, but what it does is it ships them off to the posterior pituitary. Okay, and then it's stored in the posterior pituitary. Then the posterior pituitary will secrete those, right, into the bloodstream. Right, but you get to learn more about that in chapter 17. Body temperature. Remember we were talking back in chapter 1 about thermal regulation when you're in a hot environment or a cold environment, right? Well, here the hypothalamus, all right, is going to control, all right, your body temperature in regards to warming it up or cooling it down, okay? So it plays a very important role in the regulation of our body temperature, right? So when you get a fever, the hypothalamus is turning the temperature up, right? And that's influenced, all right, by what we call prostaglandins, which are chemical messengers in your body. Okay, and again, you'll learn about that in a later chapter. All right, so wait a minute, we're not done here. Here we go. Okay, a couple more functions. Hungry? No problem. Here comes the hypothalamus. All right, it's going to monitor the nutrient levels in your blood. Okay, and if it's particularly low, all right, and some of the macromolecules there, it will then stimulate, all right, the hunger sensation, right, causing you to eat. Okay, similar type of situation, all right, when we're talking about water intake. Okay, your hypothalamus, right, also monitors, all right, how hydrated your blood is. Okay, and it has to do with the concentration of the blood plasma, which is mostly made up of water, versus the actual formed blood elements. If that ratio is off, then it's going to stimulate you to become thirsty, which is what I am right now as I take a drink of my water. Or it could be beer. You guys don't know because no one's here to see me. It really is water, though. Okay, sleep-wake rhythms. Okay, well, not only the pineal gland, all right, is going to be responsible, but guess what? What controls the pineal gland is going to be the hypothalamus. It is going to stimulate the pineal gland or pineal gland, all right, to secrete that melatonin so you can be on your normal, what we call sleep-wake cycle or circadian rhythms. Okay? Hypothalamus also plays a role in the limbic system in your emotional responses. If you lesion the hypothalamus, there is a possibility that you could have excessive reactions to certain scenarios. You could get really scared, all right, much more beyond what would be a normal fear response, all right, or even pleasure. You could have very, very odd behaviors in regards to having pleasurable experiences, okay? But the hypothalamus is involved with that, okay? So this is just depicting, all right, all these different nuclei within the hypothalamus. Now you're going to talk more about the paraventricular and the supraoptic nucleus in 211, so I'm not going to jump into that right now. But you can see here is the infundibulum right here, right? And that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary here. Okay? So there is a direct connection between those two structures. All right. Let's get into the third region of the brain, the brainstem. Okay? So the brainstem is quite important. Well, one, you can read it up there on the screen there, okay? This structure is going to connect all of the other regions of the brain to one another, okay? So it's almost like a bidirectional highway, right? So it allows communication between all four regions. You're still going to have communication between the cerebrum and the diencephalon, but this is just, again, options and choices are wonderful to have, okay? So the brainstem allows communication or connection, all right, to all of those four, all the regions there, but they allow the whole brain in all four regions to communicate to spinal cord. Where are you? Spinal cord. So the brainstem is a bidirectional highway. What does that mean? You've got information going up towards the cerebrum and the other regions of the brain. You have information coming down and leaving the brain and going down to the spinal cord. So we call those tracts, obviously. Those that are going up, right, towards the cerebrum, to the cortex, are ascending. And ascending tracts, you need to know this, are also known as sensory. I'm going to write this out. Well, I've started now. All right, sensory, and then descending tracts are motor. Okay, I'm not even going to write that. All right. But important to know, all right, your brainstem contains, right, autonomic nuclei, okay, which has to do with the autonomic centers of your brain, like breathing, all right, blood pressure, vasomotor, heart rate, all right, nuclei to your cranial nerves, right, which we'll go over in lab. We'll talk about the cranial nerves today. And also reflexes, all right, gag reflex, vomiting, sneezing, coughing, all right. All these reflex centers, these autonomic nuclei, are located here in the brainstem. So there's three parts. We learned those in lab. Right? We've got the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Okay? So here's a picture of the brainstem, and I tell folks, think of the brainstem as like an ice cream cone. So here's the ice cream cone right here. And then on top of the ice cream cone, you got 2 scoops of ice cream. That's the thalamus. Okay? So this picture here, what we're looking at is the front of the brainstem. You can see, all right, also, we've got some cranial nerves popping off of there. We'll go over those, all right, in lab. Okay? So you've got your midbrain here, your pons, and then the medulla oblongata here. Okay. I will show you a side view. Okay. This is on the back side. This is the back over here, front's over here. So you can see here's the thalamus still. Now in the midbrain here, remember this guy here? Superior and inferior colliculi, that tectal plate I was telling you about. If we're looking at it directly from the back, it'll look like this with 4 bumps on it. Okay. Well, that is our tectal plate, all right? That has the superior and inferior colliculi. Okay. Then down here, here's the pons. All right, and then down here is the medulla oblongata. This is the back side here. All right, let's talk about the midbrain first. Okay. First structure, what we call the cerebral peduncles, and this is very important that you understand this. Okay. Cerebral peduncles are our motor tracts, also known as the pyramidal system. Okay, they're on the front, because remember, the front, our motors in the front of our car, okay? Motors in the front of the car. So these motor tracts are going to carry our voluntary motor commands. All right, that's going to be affecting our skeletal muscles. Okay? So those neurons begin in the primary motor cortex, which is in the precentral gyrus. Okay? So it's going to travel down and through these cerebral peduncles. Those are motor tracts, okay? So actually, hold on. I'm going to point those out. All right, so here you can see, all right, cerebral peduncles here. These are motor tracts. Oops, you can't see me doing that. Now you can. All right, these are the motor tracts, and these are motor tracts. So they're in the front, okay? All right, next, we have this, whoops, come on now. Next, we have this structure called the superior cerebellar peduncles. Now, cerebellum means, right, we're referring to the cerebellum, okay? So this is how the midbrain connects to the cerebellum. We haven't talked about the cerebellum yet, but cerebellum helps to refine movement, okay? So fine motor movements, all right, are influenced by the cerebellum. Okay, so if you're a surgeon and you're doing miraculous things with your fingers during surgery, someone that is very, very agile with or adept at playing the piano, right, they have very good dexterity, all right, chances are, right, their cerebellum is doing a great job, but that motor information, all right, is going to be influenced by the cerebellum. So the midbrain is connected to the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncles there. The next structure, the medial lemniscus here, we'll talk about that in a later chapter. I can't remember if it's chapter, I think it's chapter 15. We're going to talk about some of the motor tracts there. All right, but what you need to know, okay, is that in the medial lemniscus is made up of ascending fibers. Okay, now what did I say about ascending fibers? Ascending fibers are sensory fibers, right? They're also myelinated, so they'll appear to be white. Okay, so when we go and talk about, excuse me, when we go and talk about some of these sensory and motor pathways in chapter 15, all right, this you'll understand it. Maybe it's chapter 14. I can't remember. But anyways, all right, I just want you to understand that this structure is going to be found in the midbrain. The next one, the substantia nigra, this is a pretty important structure that you need to know. And because it has to do with this condition here, Parkinson's disease. Okay? Parkinson's disease has to do with decreased production of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. Okay? So in the substantia nigra, right, it has a dark appearance in it, all right, due to melanin. It's also where we have these neurons that are making dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, okay? And unfortunately, because of Parkinson's, those neurons become damaged and they degenerate, so they're not producing dopamine. So people will have those folks that have Parkinson's we'll see a lot of issues with motor movements, emotional response. Okay, so they'll have some odd reactions to certain emotional situations, right? And their pleasure pain response will be augmented, but mostly it's through the movement. You'll see folks shaking, twitching, their hands will be twitching. They'll start to lose fine motor control, right? So you definitely want to know Parkinson's disease has to do with decreased dopamine production, right, by the neurons in the substantia nigra, okay? So I'm going to show you a quick picture of these structures that I'm talking about. Okay, so here's the substantia nigra right here. Okay, so it's loaded with melanin, and it's that melanin that produces, all right, not the melanin that produces that gives it its dark appearance, but this is where we have dopamine being produced. And then, all right, right next to it, you've got your medial lemniscus here, kind of covering it up. Kind of looks, I'm doing a bad job, it kind of looks like a sickle, the medial lemniscus. Okay, I covered it up though. Hold on, I'm doing a bad job. It's not working for me. There we go, in that region there. Okay, so that's going to be the ascending sensory fibers, okay, that are going to be moving up there. All right. You can see here on the back side, on the tectal plate or the tectum, is this top portion here. That's the superior colliculus, and that has to do with, oh, hold that thought, because we're going to talk about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to let the slides do the talking for me. All right. So a couple other structures that you need to know about in the midbrain. The tegmentum here, okay, that is going to contain, all right, one of our nuclei that we mentioned earlier, all right? And we're going to talk about the reticular formation later on, so I'm not going to get into it because my time is limited here, all right? But the tegmentum is going to be mainly for postural motor control, right? And that's where part of the reticular formation comes into play, okay, with muscle tone. Okay, I remember you heard me talking about it before in chapter 10, muscle tone. Right? But the tegmentum has to do with our postural motor control. So the muscles that you're using right now and that I'm using, sitting here talking to you, right, we're going to see, all right, the neurons in the tegmentum there. You remember this structure here, the cerebral aqueduct, right? That's that tube-like structure that connects the third and fourth ventricles together. Right? And also, we're going to see this when we go through and talk about the cranial nerves, right? The cranial nerves, all right, cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, and cranial nerve 4, trochlear, their nuclei will be located here in the midbrain. And they both have to do with eye movement, okay? 3 and 4 help to control some of the muscles of the eye. All right. And then finally, on the posterior portion is the tectum. You heard me talking about the tectal plate, all right? Those 4 little bumps there, okay? The tectum has to do with those 2 top bumps, the superior colliculi, are going to have to do with visual reflexes and tracking, okay? And then the inferior colliculi has to do with auditory reflexes. Like if someone's standing behind you, calls your name, and you hear him to the left of you, and you turn your head to the left. Okay? Right, and that's back heel. Right, so here's the tectum back in this region here. Here's the cerebral aqueduct surrounded by the periaqueductal gray. All right, that's the midbrain. Let's get involved with the pons here. Okay? Pons, all right, is going to be the middle portion of the midbrain there, okay? It's going to have, all right, again, because we're going to see it's a bidirectional highway in the brainstem, we have our sensory and motor tracts, right, that are going to come, the sensory tracts are going to be ascending up towards the cerebrum, and the motor tracts are going to be descending and coming down from the cerebrum. So in this area of the midbrain, of the brainstem, we have the middle peduncle, cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so it's these fibers or structures, all right, that connect the pons to the cerebellum. Again, all right, cerebellum is going to play a role in certain movements there. Important structure here, you'll talk about it again when you do the respiratory chapter, is the pontine respiratory center. Now, this is important that you know this. Right? It's going to help to regulate. Notice I said helps, doesn't completely regulate. Okay? The respiratory center is found in a different area, right, of the brainstem, but it helps to regulate skeletal muscle breathing. Okay, if you lesion this area, your breathing will not be as smooth as it is now. Like as I'm talking to you, all right, even though I'm talking, my breathing patterns have to be regulated to help me to be able to vocalize what I'm saying to you. And the pontine respiratory center helps with that, helps my breathing to be somewhat smooth and controlled and refined. That becomes lesion. My breathing as I'm talking to you would sound different, all right? So that respiratory center helps with that, okay? Superior olivary nuclei, right? Not to be confused with the colliculi, right? This is another area that helps with sound localization in the pons. And then let's not forget our cranial nerve nuclei, right? The nuclei for cranial nerve number 5, which is trigeminal, cranial nerve 6, which is abducens, cranial nerve 7, which is facial, and cranial nerve 8, right, which is vestibular cochlear, okay? Right, those, I won't get into all of the different functions because they're quite extensive, and we're going to do that in lab, okay? So those nuclei are found, right, in the pons. So what's the pons look like? Here's the pons, right here, right? A cross section through the pons here, all right? You can see here's your middle cerebellar peduncle, which is going to connect, all right, the pons to the cerebellum, right? And then through a lot of these different regions here, you're going to have sensory and motor nerves, right? Here, fibers for the pyramidal tract, those are going to be motor neurons, right? And then you'll have some sensory scattered throughout here, okay? We'll talk about the reticular formation. We'll talk about some of the stuff in here. Again, there's just not enough time to go through everything. I only can hit the fine or higher points here. All right, the last part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. Okay, this is the final part before the brainstem transitions into the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is inferior to the brainstem there. Okay, again, it's going to have sensory and motor tracts in it. Okay, so on the front portion of the medulla, you've got the pyramids there. Okay, and the pyramids are going to hold the cortical spinal tracts. So remember these tracts, we mentioned them earlier when we were talking about projection tracts. All right, these are the motor tracts that originate up in the cerebral cortex, in the primary motor cortex, and they're going to descend all the way down, all right, through, they go into the diencephalon, all right, through the thalamus, all the way down, all right, into to the brainstem, geez, and before they get into the spinal cord here, all right? Now, last class, we talked about how the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. But the fibers have to cross over from one side to the other side, all right? Here is where we're going to see some of that crossing over. Actually, this is where we're going to see most of that crossing over. So we call that the decussation, right, of the pyramids. Right? This is where those fibers will cross over to the other side. It's not the only place, because some fibers can cross in the spinal cord too. Okay. All right. So just on either side of the pyramids, we have these structures called the olives. All right. And the olives, all right, are going to transmit information to the cerebellum in regards to proprioception. Okay. What that means is, if I ask you to stand, all right, stand up, put your feet together, right, with your arms, stand in the anatomical position. And then I say, okay, I want you to lift your right leg off the ground and stand there like a stork does. Okay, that's not too bad. Now I ask you, close your eyes. So basically, I'm testing your balance, but also I'm testing your proprioception because I've taken your visual system out of it because your eyes are closed. So how well you can maintain that balance in that position has to do with what we call proprioception. Proprioception is your body's spatial awareness. So all the nerves, receptors, we call proprioceptors, that are in the joints of your feet, your ankles, your knees, your hips, all right, even your trunk. Right? Mainly proprioceptors are found around muscles and tendons and joints, right? All those are going to be sending information up through your spinal cord to, all right, the medulla oblongata and then eventually into the cerebellum. So that cerebellum is able to process that information to make fine corrections and movements to how you're standing so you don't tip over. That's a long explanation for the owls. But anyways, you deserve to know. All right. And then finally, we have the inferior cerebral peduncles. Again, this is the way that the medulla is able to connect to the cerebellum. All right, here comes one of my favorite slides. Autonomic nuclei of the medulla. All right, that's why this is one of the most crucial regions of the brain, because you have all these structures here. All right, the cardiac center, the vasomotor center, the medullary respiratory center. Those three autonomic nuclei pretty much are responsible for keeping you alive. Okay, the cardiac center obviously is going to control your heart's output, and it can do so by regulating the heart rate and also the force of contraction. You get to learn more in detail in 211, so hold on to that, okay? But it basically controls your cardiac output, okay? The vasomotor center, simple, will regulate the diameter of how big or how small your blood vessels are, okay? So it plays a huge role, right? This region here, because I didn't tell you the formula. Blood pressure, there's a formula for blood pressure, okay? Blood pressure equals heart rate. Oh, man. Let's do this. Blood pressure equals heart rate times PVR. Okay. So what is that? What is that? All right, we know what heart rate is. Okay, so the cardiac center will help to play a role in your blood pressure. TPR stands for total peripheral resistance. All right, total peripheral resistance has to do with the diameter of your blood vessels. If your blood vessel has a diameter that's this big, blood can flow through that pretty easily. Okay, but what happens if it's this big? Okay, if the diameter is that big and you got all this blood that needs to go through there, that blood is going to experience more resistance. All right, and that factors into total peripheral resistance. And if we increase the total peripheral resistance, then we're going to increase our blood pressure. So that's why vasomotor center will strongly influence your blood pressure. And finally, we got the medullary respiratory center. Okay, this is basically your breathing rate. Okay, how fast or how slow. Okay, and it has both the dorsal and the ventral respiratory groups, and we'll talk more about this in 211. Okay, but it does, all right, have a communication pathway with the pontine respiratory center. Okay, so it helps to influence the respiratory rate. And then I said there's some other reflex centers that are located in the medulla oblongata. All right, they're listed below: coughing, sneezing, vomiting, salivating, swallowing. All right, so a lot of these reflexes are going to be found in the medulla oblongata. There's quite a few structures in the medulla oblongata that are going to be critical they're vital. Right? If something happens to those, if a spike were to be through that region of your brain, there's a good chance you'd be dead. Okay. All right. And we've got a couple cranial nerve nuclei that are located there. All right, vestibular cochlear. All right, that is 8. Glossopharyngeal is 9. Vagus is 10. Accessory is 11, and then hypoglossal is 12. Cranial nerve 12. And then we can't forget about the nucleus cuneatus and the nucleus gracilis. Right, these guys have to do with somatic sensory information, which is one, information that we can consciously perceive, like deep touch, vibration. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, the nervous information that comes from the nucleus cuneatus and the nucleus gracilis is going to be somatic, which means we can consciously perceive that. Okay, it's going to travel through these two nuclei as it's ascending up towards the cerebral cortex. It has to go through the medial lemniscus, which I mentioned earlier. That's up in the midbrain there. Okay, and then eventually to the thalamus, and then onward to the cerebral cortex somewhere. Okay. So here's a quick picture here of the medulla oblongata. All right, and you can just see here, here's the fourth ventricle. Right, we've got several nuclei here for some of our cranial nerves, along with some of the nerves themselves. Right, in the front here, we got our pyramids, and then on the just lateral to them, we have the olives there. Okay, you can see it here from the side. All right, quickly, let's jump into the cerebellum. Okay, the cerebellum, this is the last part of the 4 regions of the brain. All right, it's like the little brain. Okay, so it's similar in that it has its own right and left cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, and those cerebellar hemispheres will have their own version of lobes. They just have 2, the anterior and the posterior lobes. Okay, in between the 2 hemispheres, we saw this in lab, is the vermis. Right, this is going to be found right between the left and the right cerebellar hemisphere. Okay, and it is going to get sensory information. Where is that? Okay, sensory information, all right, mainly from your midsection, your torso, but also when we're talking about balance, we're going to be getting proprioceptive information from there. Okay. So again, similar to the cerebrum, we have an outer gray matter. We call that the cerebellar cortex, of course, and then just internal to that, or deep to that, is the arbor vitae, which we saw in lab, the tree of life. Okay, that's going to be our white matter. Then scattered throughout, right, we're going to have some of our cerebellar nuclei, which again, nuclei are going to be made up of gray matter here. Okay, so this slide here quickly talks about, all right, the cerebellum and then the different cerebellar peduncles and where they go to. Okay, so just remember, superior cerebellar goes to the midbrain, middle cerebellar goes to the pons, inferior cerebellar goes to the medulla oblongata. Quick picture here. All right, you can see the 2 different hemispheres. Right, in the middle is the vermis. Okay, and then our midsection dissection here of the cerebellum. Right, you can see you've got your cerebellar cortex, gray matter on the outside, and then deep to that, our arbor vitae is going to be that white matter. And then we'll have some of our cerebellar nuclei scattered within. I'm going to stop here because I love to talk about this stuff and I don't want to rush it. I know I've got like a minute or 2 left and I'm not going to rush it. So let's do this, folks. Let's take a quick 10-15 minute break. All right. And then what we'll do is we'll meet back in lab.